In the basement of the University of Pennsylvania's Moore School of Electrical Engineering, something extraordinary was taking shape in the dying days of World War II. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't compact, it was a monster. A 30-ton behemoth that consumed more electricity than a small neighborhood and generated so much heat that it threatened to cook itself from the inside out. This was ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, and it represented humanity's first serious attempt to build a brain out of metal, glass, and wire. What few people understood at the time was that ENIAC wasn't just a machine. It was the opening salvo in a technological arms race that would define the second half of the 20th century. And it would do so not through miniaturization and elegance, but through sheer, overwhelming physical presence. The story of the supercomputer era is often told as a tale of exponential growth and Moore's law, of transistors shrinking and capabilities expanding. But there's another story, equally compelling and far more visceral, about the period when computing power was directly proportional to physical size. These weren't sleek devices that fit in your pocket or even on your desk. They were architectural statements, machines so large they required specially reinforced floors, so power-hungry they needed their own substations, so temperamental they employed teams of engineers who did nothing but keep them running. They were cathedrals built to calculation, monuments to humanity's desire to transcend the limitations of the human mind through brute force and inspired engineering. ENIAC occupied over 1,800 square feet of floor space and contained 17,468 vacuum tubes, 7,200 crystal diodes, 1,500 relays, 70,000 resistors, 10,000 capacitors, and approximately 5 million hand-soldered joints. To program it, operators had to physically reconfigure the machine by setting switches and reconnecting cables, a process that could take days. When it finally came online in December 1945, it could perform 5,000 additions per second, a speed that seems laughably slow by modern standards, but represented a quantum leap over anything that had come before. Human computers, the rooms full of people, mostly women, who performed calculations by hand, might take weeks to solve problems that ENIAC could handle in hours. But ENIAC's true significance wasn't just its speed, it was proof of concept. It demonstrated that electronic computing on a grand scale was possible, and it ignited imaginations across the scientific and military establishment. If one massive machine could perform calculations at this speed, what could an even larger, even more sophisticated machine accomplish? This question would drive computer development for the next 3 decades, leading to machines that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible and occasionally tipped over those boundaries entirely. The 1950s saw computers as commercial and scientific tools, but these were not devices for the masses. IBM's 701, introduced in 1952, was designed primarily for scientific and military calculations. It used 4,000 vacuum tubes and required a dedicated air conditioning system that consumed more power than the computer itself. Only 19 units were ever built, each one custom installed in facilities that had been specially modified to accommodate its needs. The machine filled an entire room, and organizations that purchased one needed to hire specialized staff who understood its temperamental nature. Vacuum tubes failed constantly. On average, one tube would burn out every few hours, and replacing them was an art form that required speed, knowledge, and sometimes pure luck. The real breakthrough in physical computing came with the development of magnetic core memory in the early 1950s. Before core memory, computers relied on various storage methods, including mercury delay lines, Williams tubes, and other exotic technologies that were either slow, unreliable, or both. Core memory used tiny magnetic rings threaded with wires, and while it was still large by modern standards, a memory unit might contain thousands of these rings in a cabinet the size of a refrigerator. It was revolutionary in its reliability and speed. The only problem was that it was fantastically expensive and had to be assembled largely by hand, often by workers with excellent fine motor skills who could thread the delicate wires through the ferrite cores without breaking them. As computers grew more capable, they also grew more massive. The SAGE, Semi-Automatic Ground Environment System, developed in the 1950s to coordinate continental air defense during the Cold War, represented the pinnacle of brute force computing. Each SAGE installation filled an entire building and required up to 49,000 vacuum tubes. The system consumed 3 megawatts of power, enough to serve a town of several thousand people. SAGE computers weighed 250 tons each, and 52 of them were eventually built across North America. The project cost over $8 billion in 1950s dollars, making it one of the most expensive computer projects ever undertaken. It was also one of the most influential, establishing many of the concepts that would later become standard in computing, including real-time processing, networking, and interactive displays. But it was the arrival of the transistor that truly unleashed the supercomputer era. Transistors were smaller, more reliable, and more energy efficient than vacuum tubes, and they opened up possibilities that had been pure fantasy just years before. The first transistorized supercomputers emerged in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and while they were still enormous by any reasonable standard, they represented a new level of computational sophistication. The IBM 7090, introduced in 1959, could perform 229,000 floating-point operations per second. It was fast enough to perform complex simulations, model nuclear weapons, and support the emerging space program. The space race, in fact, became one of the primary drivers of supercomputer development. NASA's Mission Control in Houston relied on IBM mainframes to calculate trajectories, monitor spacecraft systems, and support real-time decision-making during missions. These weren't distributed systems in the modern sense. If the computer went down, the mission was in serious jeopardy. The stakes were literally life and death, and the machines had to work perfectly every time, under conditions that would have destroyed less robust systems. Engineers developed elaborate backup systems, redundant components, and monitoring systems that watched the watchers, all in service of keeping these massive machines operational during critical missions. Then came Seymour Cray, and everything changed. Cray was a peculiar genius who believed that the future of computing lay not in general-purpose machines, but in specialized systems designed for one thing: speed. In 1964, while working at Control Data Corporation, he unveiled the CDC 6600, widely considered the first true supercomputer. It could perform 3 million floating-point operations per second, more than 10 times faster than any other machine in existence. IBM had dominated the computer industry for years, but the 6600 made their offerings look sluggish. Thomas Watson Jr., IBM's chairman, reportedly wrote an angry memo to his engineers asking, "How could this happen? Cray has only a few engineers working for him, while we have armies of them."
What Watson didn't fully appreciate was that Cray's approach was fundamentally different. While IBM built general-purpose machines designed to handle a wide variety of tasks, Cray designed specialized systems optimized for scientific and technical computing. The CDC 6600 introduced innovations that would become standard in supercomputer design: parallel processing units, a central processor surrounded by peripheral processors that handled input-output operations, and a sophisticated cooling system that allowed the machine to run at higher speeds without melting. The computer was shaped like a plus sign, with each arm containing different components, and the entire structure stood about 5 feet tall and occupied significant floor space. But Cray wasn't satisfied. He left control data in 1972 to found his own company, Cray Research, with the explicit goal of building the fastest computer in the world. The result was the Cray 1, unveiled in 1976, and it was a masterpiece of both engineering and design. Instead of filling a room with rectangular cabinets, Cray shaped his computer into a graceful C-curve that stood about 6 feet tall. The exterior was covered in shimmering panels that could be removed to reveal the dense circuitry within. Around the base was a padded bench where operators could sit, partly because Cray thought it looked good and partly because it concealed the power supply and cooling system. The Cray 1 could perform 160 million floating-point operations per second, making it by far the fastest computer in the world. It achieved this through a combination of innovations: vector processing, which allowed it to perform the same operation on multiple data points simultaneously; extremely short wire lengths, which reduced signal propagation delays; and an innovative cooling system that pumped freon through channels in the machine to dissipate heat. The entire system weighed 5.5 tons and consumed 115 kilowatts of power. It cost between $5 million and $8 million, and despite this astronomical price, Cray Research sold over 80 units to laboratories, government agencies, and research institutions around the world. The Cray 1 became iconic not just for its performance, but for what it represented: the idea that computational power could be beautiful. Cray himself was deeply involved in every aspect of the design, from the circuit boards to the exterior panels. He believed that elegant engineering led to elegant machines, and the Cray 1 proved him right. Photographs of the computer appeared in museums and design exhibitions. It became a symbol of cutting-edge technology, appearing in movies and television shows as shorthand for the most advanced computer in the world. But even as the Cray 1 was dazzling the computing world, the seeds of its obsolescence were already being planted. The same year the Cray 1 was unveiled, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak introduced the Apple I, a crude personal computer that could be built from components available at electronics stores. It wasn't even in the same universe as the Cray 1 in terms of capabilities, but it pointed toward a different future, one where computing power would be distributed, personalized, and eventually miniaturized to the point where it could fit in your pocket. The 1980s saw the supercomputer industry reach its physical zenith. Machines grew larger, more complex, and more expensive. The Cray 2, introduced in 1985, was the most powerful computer in the world and also one of the most exotic. It pushed the boundaries of physics so hard that air cooling was no longer sufficient. Instead, the machine was immersed in a bath of fluorinert, a clear coolant developed by 3M. The Cray 2 looked like an aquarium filled with circuit boards, glowing softly as electricity flowed through its components. It could perform 1.9 billion floating-point operations per second, and it consumed 200 kilowatts of power, enough to run dozens of homes.
These machines were used for tasks that seemed impossible to human minds: simulating nuclear explosions without actually testing weapons, modeling climate systems to predict weather patterns, designing aircraft that could fly faster and more efficiently, cracking encryption codes, and rendering computer graphics for movies. The supercomputer centers that housed these machines became temples of scientific computing, places where researchers from around the world would submit jobs and wait days or weeks for results. The machines ran continuously, never shutting down except for maintenance, processing jobs in queues that were carefully managed to maximize utilization. But maintaining these behemoths was a Herculean task. Teams of engineers worked around the clock to keep them operational. Circuit boards failed and had to be replaced. Cooling systems developed leaks. Power supplies fluctuated. Software bugs caused crashes that required hours to diagnose. The Cray 2's liquid cooling system was particularly troublesome. The fluorinert had to be kept perfectly clean, free of even microscopic contaminants that could cause short circuits. Engineers developed elaborate filtration systems and handling protocols.
Working on a Cray 2 meant sometimes reaching into a tank of liquid to swap out boards while the machine was still running, a task that required steady nerves and perfect concentration. Meanwhile, a quiet revolution was underway. Microprocessors, those tiny silicon chips that powered personal computers, were becoming faster and more sophisticated with each generation. In 1985, the same year the Cray 2 was introduced, Intel released the 8386 processor, which could perform calculations at speeds that would have been respectable in a small mainframe just a decade earlier. It fit on a chip the size of a postage stamp. As microprocessors improved, engineers began to realize something profound. Instead of building one massive, expensive computer, they could connect thousands of smaller, cheaper processors together and have them work in parallel on the same problem. This insight would eventually kill the giant supercomputer, but it took longer than anyone expected. The 1990s saw supercomputers continue to grow in physical size and complexity, even as the writing appeared on the wall. The Thinking Machine's CM5, introduced in 1991, looked like something from science fiction, a cluster of black towers arranged in a semicircle, each containing thousands of processors working in parallel. It could scale to over 1,000 processing nodes and achieve performance measured in tens of billions of operations per second. But it cost tens of millions of dollars, required specialized software to program effectively, and competed against clusters of workstations that could achieve comparable performance at a fraction of the cost. The Japanese threw everything they had at the supercomputer challenge, viewing it as a matter of national technological prestige. The numerical wind tunnel, completed in 1993 at the National Aerospace Laboratory, was designed specifically to simulate airflow around aircraft and spacecraft. It contained 166 vector processors arranged in a massive parallel array and could perform 124 billion floating-point operations per second. The machine filled a building and required 2.4 megawatts of power. It was briefly the fastest computer in the world, a title that had immense symbolic value, but increasingly little practical meaning as distributed computing systems began to dominate. What killed the giant supercomputer wasn't any single technological breakthrough, but rather the cumulative effect of Moore's law. As microprocessors doubled in power every 18 to 24 months, as Gordon Moore had predicted, the economics of computing shifted inexorably towards smaller, more distributed systems. By the mid-1990s, it was possible to build a cluster of hundreds or thousands of commodity processors running Linux, connect them with high-speed networking, and achieve supercomputer-level performance at a fraction of the cost of a traditional supercomputer. These Beowulf clusters, named after the epic poem, weren't as elegant as a Cray, but they were far more practical and economical.
The final nail in the coffin came from an unexpected direction: video games. Graphics processors, or GPUs, were designed to render 3D graphics for games, but researchers discovered that they could also be used for general-purpose computing. A modern GPU contains thousands of small processors working in parallel, exactly the architecture needed for many scientific computing tasks. By the late 2000s, supercomputers began incorporating GPUs alongside traditional processors, achieving dramatic performance improvements. The era of the monolithic, custom-built supercomputer was over. The future belonged to hybrid systems, built from components that were, increasingly, available off the shelf. Yet, the story of these giant machines remains important, not just as technological history, but as a reminder of how we approach problems at the edge of possibility. The engineers who built ENIAC, SAGE, and the Cray supercomputers didn't have the luxury of waiting for technology to mature. They needed to solve problems immediately, calculating ballistic trajectories, coordinating air defense, simulating nuclear weapons. And they did so by building machines that pushed physics to its limits.
These computers were testaments to human ambition and ingenuity, monuments to the idea that some problems are worth solving no matter the cost. Today's supercomputers are far more powerful than their predecessors, but they're also more prosaic. The fastest supercomputer in the world, as of this writing, is essentially a warehouse full of processors and GPUs, impressive in its scale, but lacking the architectural drama of a Cray 1 or the sheer audacious physicality of ENIAC. We've gained enormously in capability, but we've lost something too. The sense that a computer could be a singular object, a machine with personality and presence, something you could stand before and feel a sense of awe at what human beings had created. The giant computers that nearly tipped history, literally in some cases, as their weight required reinforced floors, remind us that technology isn't inevitable. Each breakthrough required thousands of decisions, each one made by engineers and designers working at the edge of their knowledge. They made mistakes. They pursued dead ends. They built machines that consumed phenomenal resources and delivered results that seem modest by modern standards. But they also pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and in doing so, they created the foundation for everything that followed. The smartphone in your pocket contains more computing power than all of the Cray supercomputers ever built combined. But it exists because someone once decided to fill a room with vacuum tubes and see what happened. That legacy of audacity, ambition, and the willingness to build something enormous in pursuit of something important is the true inheritance of the supercomputer era. These machines didn't just perform calculations. They proved that the impossible was merely the not yet accomplished, waiting for someone brave enough or crazy enough to attempt it. That's a lesson worth remembering, even in an age when the most powerful computers in the world look less like cathedrals and more like data centers humming away in anonymity as they reshape our world. The physical legacy of these giant machines extends beyond their technological contributions into the realm of infrastructure and institutional memory. Walk through the computer museums that exist today, and you'll find these behemoths carefully preserved, their panels polished, their circuit boards frozen in time. The Computer History Museum in Mountain View, California, houses a restored IBM 1401, a machine that once required its own climate-controlled room and a staff of trained operators. Volunteers spend thousands of hours maintaining these artifacts, replacing aging components, documenting their operation, and occasionally powering them up to demonstrate what computing once meant. These aren't just historical curiosities, they're physical evidence of a fundamentally different relationship between humans and machines.
The buildings that housed these supercomputers tell their own stories. The Eckert-Mackley Computer Corporation's factory in Philadelphia, where UNIVAC machines were assembled in the 1950s, had loading docks designed specifically to handle multi-ton computer components. The floors were reinforced concrete, capable of bearing weights that would have caused ordinary office buildings to sag or collapse. Electrical systems were industrial grade, with transformers and circuit breakers sized for equipment that drew power like small factories. Air conditioning systems were massive, designed not for human comfort, but to keep rooms at precisely controlled temperatures regardless of the season. Some of these buildings still stand, repurposed for other uses, but their architecture betrays their origins. Unusually high ceilings, mysterious conduits in the walls, raised floors that once concealed forests of cables. The human systems that grew up around these machines were equally elaborate. Operating a supercomputer in the 1960s or 1970s required a specialized priesthood of engineers, programmers, and technicians, each with their own arcane knowledge. There were the hardware engineers, who understood the physical machines at the component level, who could diagnose problems from the pattern of lights on a console or the particular smell of an overheating circuit. There were the systems programmers, who maintained the operating systems and compilers, often working in assembly language or machine code to squeeze every ounce of performance from the hardware. There were the application programmers, who wrote the scientific codes, translating mathematical equations into instructions the machines could execute. And then there were the operators, perhaps the most underappreciated members of this technical ecosystem. They were the ones who actually ran the machines day to day, loading magnetic tapes, mounting disk packs, replacing printer paper, and monitoring the consoles for errors. In the batch processing era that dominated early computing, operators were the intermediaries between users and machines. Scientists and engineers would submit their jobs, programs and data recorded on punch cards or magnetic tape, and operators would schedule them, load them into the computer, collect the output, and return it to the users. A skilled operator could keep a supercomputer running at peak efficiency, minimizing idle time and maximizing throughput. A careless one could crash the machine or, worse, cause data loss that set research projects back weeks or months. The batch processing model itself shaped how people thought about computation. You didn't interact with a supercomputer in real time. You planned your work carefully, submitted it to the queue, and waited. Sometimes you waited hours. Sometimes you waited days. If your program had a bug, you didn't find out until the job ran and failed, at which point you had to fix the problem and resubmit, starting the waiting process all over again. This enforced a discipline that has largely disappeared from modern programming. You checked your code meticulously before submission because debugging cycles were so expensive. You thought through your algorithms carefully because computational time was precious and had to be justified. The economics of these machines created their own distortions. A Cray 1 in the late 1970s might cost $8 million to purchase, plus hundreds of thousands of dollars per year in maintenance, electricity, and staffing. Only the largest corporations, government agencies, and research institutions could afford them. This created a computational aristocracy, those with access to supercomputers and those without. Researchers would compete fiercely for time on these machines, writing grant proposals that justified their need for computational resources. Allocation committees would judge these proposals, deciding who got access and for how long. Some institutions developed elaborate accounting systems to charge different research groups for their computer usage, creating internal markets for computational time. This scarcity shaped scientific research in profound ways. Some problems were simply too computationally expensive to attempt. Others were pursued specifically because supercomputer time was available. The availability of computational resources became a constraint on scientific inquiry, determining which questions could be asked and which had to wait. Climate modeling, for instance, emerged as a major scientific discipline in large part because supercomputers made it possible to simulate atmospheric and oceanic systems at scales that had previously been impossible. Nuclear weapons research similarly depended on supercomputers. Once atmospheric testing was banned, simulation became the only way to validate weapon designs and ensure the reliability of existing arsenals. The military and intelligence communities were, from the beginning, the primary drivers of supercomputer development. The connection wasn't subtle or hidden, it was explicit and openly acknowledged. ENIAC was built to calculate artillery firing tables. The early IBM computers were purchased primarily by defense contractors and government agencies. The CDC 6600 and Cray 1 found their largest markets in weapons laboratories and intelligence agencies. This created an unusual dynamic where cutting-edge computing technology was both highly publicized — Cray computers appeared in magazines and museums — and deeply classified. You could see a Cray 1, but you couldn't know what calculations it was performing or what problems it was solving. The National Security Agency, in particular, was a voracious consumer of computing power. Though details remain classified, it's clear that the NSA purchased some of the most advanced computers ever built and used them for cryptanalysis and signals intelligence. The agency's requirements pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and manufacturers knew that an NSA contract could make or break their company. This created an unusual dynamic where cutting-edge computing technology was both highly publicized — Cray computers appeared in magazines and museums — and deeply classified. You could see a Cray 1, but you couldn't know what calculations it was performing or what problems it was solving. The National Security Agency, in particular, was a voracious consumer of computing power.
Though details remain classified, it's clear that the NSA purchased some of the most advanced computers ever built and used them for cryptanalysis and signals intelligence. The agency's requirements pushed the boundaries of what was possible, and manufacturers knew that an NSA contract could make or break their company. This created an unusual dynamic where cutting-edge computing technology was both highly publicized — Cray computers appeared in magazines and museums — and deeply classified. You could see a Cray one, but you couldn't know what calculations it was performing or what problems it was solving. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, pursued its own supercomputer program, though always from a position of disadvantage. Soviet computers were typically several years behind their American counterparts, hobbled by inferior manufacturing capabilities and the difficulty of obtaining advanced components in the face of Western export controls. The Soviets responded with a combination of espionage, indigenous development, and brute force. Soviet scientists became expert at wringing performance from limited hardware, developing clever algorithms that could accomplish with slower machines what American researchers did with faster ones. Some Soviet computers were direct copies of Western designs, built from stolen blueprints or reverse-engineered from smuggled components. Others were original designs that reflected different engineering philosophies and constraints. The most famous Soviet supercomputer was probably the BESM-6, designed by Sergei Lebedev and introduced in 1968. It could perform about 1 million operations per second, impressive by Soviet standards, but well behind the CDC 6600. What made the BESM-6 significant was its longevity. Variants remained in production and use into the 1990s, long after they had become obsolete by Western standards. This reflected a fundamental difference in how the two systems approached technology. Western supercomputers were expected to become obsolete quickly, replaced by newer, faster models in a rapid cycle of innovation. Soviet computers were built to last, upgraded incrementally, and kept in service far longer than their designers ever anticipated.
The end of the Cold War didn't eliminate the strategic importance of supercomputing, but it changed the dynamics dramatically. Export controls remained, but they became harder to enforce as computing technology became more distributed and commercially available. China emerged as a major player, first by purchasing Western supercomputers, then by building its own. Japanese and European manufacturers, never quite able to match American dominance in the commercial market, found niches in scientific and research computing. The supercomputer market became truly global, with centers of excellence scattered across continents. One of the most interesting developments was the rise of cryptocurrency mining in the 2010s, which created a bizarre parallel to the supercomputer era. Bitcoin mining farms, warehouses filled with specialized processors designed to solve cryptographic puzzles, recreated many of the characteristics of 1960s computer centers. They required enormous amounts of electricity, specialized cooling systems, and teams of technicians to keep them running. They were too expensive for individuals to operate profitably, leading to centralization and economies of scale. They even faced some of the same political and social challenges, with communities resisting their construction due to noise, power consumption, and concerns about their utility. The difference was that while supercomputers solved problems that advanced human knowledge, cryptocurrency mining solved problems that existed only to maintain the cryptocurrency networks themselves, an Ouroboros of computation consuming vast resources to validate its own existence. The environmental cost of these machines deserves consideration. A Cray 2 consuming 200 kilowatts running continuously for a year would use 1.75 gigawatt-hours of electricity, equivalent to the annual electricity consumption of about 160 American homes. Multiply that by all the supercomputers in operation at any given time, and the numbers become staggering. Yet the equation was never simple. Weather prediction supercomputers, for instance, consumed enormous amounts of power, but they enabled more accurate forecasts that helped farmers optimize irrigation, allowed airlines to route flights more efficiently, and gave coastal communities warning before hurricanes struck. The energy invested in computation generated returns in the form of energy and resources saved elsewhere in the economy. Modern data centers, which have largely replaced the supercomputer centers of old, face similar trade-offs at vastly larger scales. A major data center might consume 100 megawatts or more, enough to power a small city, running thousands or millions of processors in parallel. These facilities are designed with elaborate power management and cooling systems, using outside air when possible, recycling heat, and locating in regions where electricity is cheap and renewable. They represent the logical endpoint of the supercomputer trajectory. Computation at scales that would have been unimaginable to the pioneers of the field, solving problems so complex and varied that no single machine could handle them all. Yet something was lost in the transition from supercomputers to distributed systems. A Cray 1 was a coherent object, a machine you could understand as a unified whole, even if you couldn't comprehend every detail. A modern data center is almost incomprehensible. Rack after rack of identical servers, miles of networking cables, cooling systems that span buildings, power systems that rival utility substations. No single person understands it all. It's not a machine, but an ecosystem, constantly evolving, never entirely stable, always in flux. The engineers who work in these facilities are specialists focused on narrow slices of the whole. The sense of craftsmanship that Seymour Cray brought to his designs has given way to industrial-scale deployment of commodity components.
This isn't necessarily bad, it's simply different. The democratization of computing power has enabled innovations that would have been impossible in the supercomputer era. Every smartphone user has access to computational resources that would have cost millions of dollars 40 years ago. Cloud computing puts supercomputer-level capabilities within reach of startups and individuals. The barriers to entry have collapsed, unleashing creativity and innovation in ways that the old model, with its gatekeepers and allocation committees, never could have achieved. But the physical grandeur of the supercomputer era remains compelling. These were machines that demanded respect, that imposed themselves on the world through sheer presence. When you stood in front of a Cray 1, you knew you were in the presence of something significant. It looked like the future because it was the future, made tangible and real. Modern computers, for all their vastly greater capabilities, rarely inspire that sense of awe. They're hidden in bland buildings, reduced to abstract services accessed through screens, dematerialized into the cloud as if computation happens by magic rather than through millions of physical processes occurring in real hardware somewhere in the world. The preservation of these historic machines becomes more important as their original operators and designers age and pass away. Each restoration project is a race against time, tracking down aging components, documenting knowledge that exists only in the memories of people who worked with the machines decades ago, preserving not just the hardware, but the tacit knowledge of how to operate and maintain it. The process is surprisingly difficult. Even with documentation, many details of operation were never written down because they were considered obvious to the people who worked with the machines daily. How much force do you need to seat a circuit board properly? What does a healthy machine sound like? What patterns of indicator light signal an impending failure? This knowledge was embodied in practice, shared through apprenticeship and experience, and it's vanishing as the people who possessed it retire or die. Some of the most fascinating preservation efforts involve getting these machines running again. The Computer History Museum spent years restoring an IBM 1401 to working condition, tracking down replacement parts, repairing power supplies, and debugging problems in hardware that was never designed to be turned on and off repeatedly over decades. When they finally succeeded in running a program on the restored machine, volunteers and visitors literally applauded. It wasn't just a technical achievement, it was a resurrection, bringing back to life a machine that had once been at the cutting edge of technology. Similar efforts are underway with various supercomputers, though the challenges are even greater. The specialized components these machines used are often impossible to replace. Manufacturers went out of business decades ago, and even if documentation exists, the manufacturing processes required to produce the parts no longer exist.
Preservationists sometimes have to become manufacturers themselves, reverse engineering components and fabricating replacements using modern techniques. It's painstaking work, driven by passion and a sense that these machines are worth preserving, not just as artifacts, but as functioning objects that can still demonstrate their capabilities.